The name of this particular session is Crowdsourced Market Insight, US Solar's Biggest Questions. So this is a very unique session format here. At this conference, we started this particular format about a year ago, and it's become a fixture at our events since then. It's very popular. It's an interactive session involving both our panel of distinguished experts as well as you, the audience. We're going to be posing some of US Solar's biggest and most pressing questions to all of you and polling your responses and then discussing them with our audience. So before we get started in earnest, let's run through a few housekeeping notes. So first of all of you should be provided with a clicker on your table. If you do not have one, please raise your hand and one will be provided to you right now. So the way this works, and just to get this out of the way, make it clear that our panelists' responses are reflecting their individual views and not the views of the organizations they represent. And then I'm sure the same holds for you. So we're going to go through about 10 questions, see how many we get to. And the questions will be posed on the screens here. Once the question is posed and explained, a timer will go off, a 10-second timer. So you'll have 10 seconds to respond and make your choice. It's a multiple choice format. Of course, there are no right answers here. So you'll have a chance to click on your response. You can change your response in those 10 seconds. You can't vote twice, obviously. And then following that timer, your responses will be shown on the screen. We're going to be asking our distinguished panelists for what they voted for, and then discussing the feedback and the dialogue between the audience and yourselves. So before we get started, I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves and the organizations they represent, starting with Justin.
Thanks, Shyam, and thanks for having me here on this panel. And I'm glad to see so many people here at this conference. That's a product of the work that GTM and SIA do together, and we've been doing for about 4 years now. So I'm Justin Baca. I'm Director of Research with the Solar Energy Industries Association. We're the trade association for the industry in the US, and we have about 1,000 member companies that span the globe, actually. And we work all the time in Washington and the various states to represent the interests of the industry and make sure that the market continues to grow and has the hospitable policy environment.
Josh Baribeau at Canaccord Genuity. It's a global investment bank. I'm a senior equity analyst. I've been following solar for about 8 years. I've dabbled in LED, I've dabbled in semiconductor world, and some of the other distributed storage and generation as well. Thanks, Green Tech. Thanks, Shyam, for having me. Looking forward to a discussion.
Good morning. Sanjay Ranchad with Solar City. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Electricity Markets and Regulatory Council. What that means is I help run our policy team. Appreciate all the research that GTM has been doing over the years to help all of us be better at our jobs.
My name is Mike Hall. I'm the CEO of Borrego Solar. Borrego Solar, we're a downstream company in the middle market. So commercial scale solar, small utility scale solar, we basically do everything within that market. The core of the business is EPC, but we also do greenfield development, late stage acquisitions, and then operation and maintenance on the back end. So we try and be completely comprehensive, except we're not a technology company and we don't own assets. I've been in solar and with Borrego for 12 years, so since 2002. So got to ride that roller coaster ride that Shale was showing since the early days.
Great. So clearly, SIA, Solar City, Canaccord Adams, and Borrego, 4 very well established names in the solar business, and all of you should be eminently qualified to opine on these questions we're going to go through. So let's get started here. Apologies for this delay. We have a server in Papua New Guinea that this has to be routed through. So, all right. So let's start with a high-level question. We've actually been posing this particular question on all of the crowdsourced panels so far. It's a pretty big topic question, which is, in 2030, what proportion of US electricity production will solar comprise? So just for some context, it's 2014 right now, and I think we're still comfortably under 1% of total electricity generation in the US coming through solar. So 2030, what are we looking for? So once again, do not vote until I start the timer, which will go off anytime now. Once again, Papua New Guinea. Go. Okay, so the responses are in, and it looks like options number 2 and 3, being 5 to 10%, 10 to 20%, represent about 80% of your responses. So the audience generally believes it's going to be between 5 to 20%. That's quite a, it's definitely a non-linear shift over the next 15 years or so. So let's see how our panel voted, starting with you, Justin, and why.
Well, aside from having reviewed a number of reports over the past few years that suggest that it will actually be between 10 and 20% through some pretty rigorous modeling, if we look at the pace of installations that GTM has put out and other analysts have put out, we can get there at the current expected run rates, and we're looking at probably a few hundred gigawatts worth of solar capacity to achieve that. And that means, installing 10 to 15 gigawatts per year, and I think that's pretty achievable over that time frame.
So you voted for number 3.
I did, yes. Yep.
Josh, how about you?
I voted for 2, almost with the exact same numbers, 10 to 15, maybe a couple of years of 20 gigawatts to get to a 10% number. I think is around 200 gigawatts, give or take. So I'm kind of at that 10% range, so it could have gone either way, but I guess for conservatism, we'll say number 2.
Sanjay?
I also voted for number 3, same reasoning, and I think no disagreement with the assumptions here. The distributed generation part of the market is going to continue to grow. You're seeing that already, and so 2030 is a long ways off, and we have to think about the climate imperative. There's an ecological imperative that we greatly ramp up renewable production in this country, and we'll continue to see impacts of climate change. I think that will have political impacts and affect the support for continued solar generation.
Right.
I voted for 4, and I was just right. That's the right answer, the correct answer. No, I was inspired by the Bill Walton no-brainer quote. But seriously, actually, so I've been in solar a long time, and I'm actually known in the office and in the company as kind of being the pessimist, the guy who's no, there's no way that can be true. When panels were $380, I'm there's no way they're going to under $3. And when there were utility RFPs that were clearing at 12 cents, I'm oh, those are crazy. Those are never going to get built. And so I'm just I've realized I'm wrong, and the industry just it's just going to exceed. It's gonna overcome all this analysis. I think it's just gonna swamp out everything. And 2030 is far enough out that I think it happens.
Right. 2030 is far out, but still a pretty big call for more than 20%. One thing I'm curious about, if any one of you would like to respond. So, we've talked about the solar growth story here, but then if you're looking at the generation mix, there's also something to be said about the conventional generation mix, and I'm wondering, when you're thinking that far out over the next decade and a half, how you're thinking about retirements in terms of coal plants and possibly even some of the older gas plants, possibly even nuclear. Does that play a role, you see, in over the next decade and a half?
I think it definitely does. I mean, we see EPA working on finalizing its 111D rule, which is definitely going to increase the pressure to retire coal plants, and there's going to be a generation gap there that solar is well suited to help fill.
Right.
I would tend to agree as well. A lot of people, and you've seen charts before that show the decline, the second derivative of the amount of electricity that at least the United States is adding. Yet we're going to continue to add a significant amount of, or I believe the industry will continue to add a significant amount of utility scale solar as some of that stuff is retired. And I think while everyone in here knows that the price of oil has nothing to do with electricity generation or solar, I think it reopens the debate, in case anyone's forgotten, how volatile commodities can be. And I think, even if solar, for instance, right now, or maybe even in the future, isn't perfectly, at the term grid parity or something like that, there's no commodity cost ever. And so I think that's a nice hedge, and I think that's why it'll be an important part of the energy mix. And again, replacing stuff that's retiring, I think, fits into that regardless of
Well,
cost.
Josh, you had me at second derivative when you said that. As a mathematics major, I mean, that's all you needed to say. Great. Okay, so I think there's a strong consensus with some of the my calls aside, the super optimists about the generation mix being within that 5 to 20% range over the next decade and a half. So let's move on to the second question, and let's see. Let's look for a little more disparity here. Let's look for a little more disagreement, perhaps. Okay, so our next question, again, this is a high-level topic that that has been a focus of discussion in the industry for a few years now, and will get hotter and hotter over the next couple of years, which is what happens to the U.S. solar market in 2017 upon the step-down / expiration of the federal investment tax credit. I think Shale, in the morning presentation, just talked about how important the ITC has been to the growth of the market over the last decade or so. So the question I think everyone's asking themselves is how the market responds. So our first option here is there's a significant decline, which we define as a more than 20% drop-off in annual installations between 16 and 17. Second option is a marginal decline of less than 20%, but still a decline. The third option is a relatively flat market, unaffected. The fourth option is a marginal increase. So you're actually we're moving into the realm of optimism here, in asserting that possibly the market will be able to offset that reduction. And again, marginal here being defined as a less than 20% increase in the annual installation volume. And then finally, number 5 is a significant increase, which is more than 20% up. So once again, let's start voting once the timer counts down. Waiting, and go. Okay, so here's where the audience has revealed their pragmatism, I think, with this response, because predominantly we have around a little over 70% of the audience responding with option number 1 or 2, which is a significant decline or a marginal decline. So I'm interested if any of you voted for the other 3 options, 3, 4, or 5, or whether you also went with options number 1 and 2. My call again. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue in my role as the optimist. But, well, I mean, so first of all, I think I agree that shale belongs in the to-be-constructed Analyst Hall of Fame. But one thing I did want to dispute is his pie chart around the 99% of projects that are being built using the ITC, because there is a market today. It's not half of the market. I don't know what percentage it is. It'd actually be interesting if Green Tech Media wanted to figure it out, that doesn't use the ITC. And so the work that's owned by the federal government that they've bought, the work that's being done and built for municipalities where they're using tax-exempt municipal financing. So I think there is a significant portion. And so we already see, and we actually see that market growing right now. And actually it was in your report in the, I think it was the Q2 Market Insight, where you showed the portion of the market in California that's public sector. A lot of that is not PPAs. It's actually owned and isn't using the ITC. So I think there already is a market that pencils out the ITC. And then when you think about, we've done modeling forever about where do you need to be without the ITC, and we're kind of already there from a cost perspective. And then if you think about like, hey, a bunch of demand going away and this glut of supply, you can imagine another maybe step decline in cost. So I just think we end up overcoming it, just like we have every other policy issue.
It's interesting. Sanjay, yes.
Let me jump in. I voted for number 2. But I want to say this question assumes that the ITC does in fact step down at the end of 2016, and I hope that's not the case, and people will be working hard to make sure that's not the case. And then if we do in fact have a step down of the ITC as scheduled, I really hope that we do, at least as a nation, put a price on carbon. It's critical that we establish a price on carbon so we actually bring those externalities in and price them accordingly. It's sad that we're talking about a step down of the ITC when at the same time Congress is ready to approve the KXL pipeline. So I hope that we're not talking about this. But I think that the reason that I voted for number 2 is there's going to be a significant pull-in effect of the expiration in 2016 if it does occur. And I think that's really going to be true of large-scale, utility-scale projects. The distributed generation market is continuing to grow sustainably, and I think will be far less impacted by the step-down of the ITC.
Right, and so just to reiterate what you said, I think Shale mentioned this at the morning presentation, where because of the visibility the industry has, you're going to see a lot of projects, even where the PPAs begin in 2017, ultimately install the year before that to avail of the ITC. So one other point you made actually, Sanjay, which is relevant, is this: when we talk about the expiration and step down on the ITC, this is what is in place right now. It need not be the case in the final analysis. So Justin, I'm curious, at SIA, based in Washington, can you shed some light on exactly, how you see things playing out over the next, in terms of the final result for the step down and expiration of the ITC? Is SIA actually working actively to advocate on that front?
Oh, absolutely. It should come as no surprise that working on the ITC is SIA's top priority over the next 2 years, and it's going to be a challenge. I mean, just to let you know, I voted for number 1 just because we have seen that pull-in effect with 2016 for the utility scale projects, and the impact of that alone is going to create more than a 20% drop, regardless of what you see happening with the DG market segments. So yeah, but it is a very high priority for SIA, and to the extent that we have companies in here that are not members of SIA, we encourage you to get involved as well, both by joining SIA and by getting to know your members of Congress, because it is going to be a fight, and there is a good chance that it's going to come down to the 11th hour. And that's another issue with the step down of the ITC is the timing. The impact that it has on the market looks very different if it's extended tomorrow versus it's extended on December 30th, 2016. That in fact impacts your pipelines and what you do, and trying to push your projects forward, or relaxing a little bit in what you do with your staff buildup. It matters. Regardless of whether or not you think the market can survive or what you think happens to the addressable market in 2017, a 20% drop overnight is very distortionary.
Right. So once again, to reiterate the audience's response, it looks like the large majority, around more than 70%, have voted for either a significant or a marginal decline to the market in 2017. And once again, this is based on the current status quo, which again is subject to revision. Okay, question number 3. Question number 3. Okay, and this is about the residential solar landscape. So now we've talked about a couple of the high-level questions about the market at large, and we're going to start to dig a little bit deeper now in the remaining questions. So how will the residential solar installation landscape look in 2030? And this is about consolidation, obviously, which is option number 1, a small number of large installers, the Solar Cities, the Vivint, essentially the space contracts. Number 2 is a large number of small installers, which is sort of harkening back to the early half of the decade in the US, where you had essentially mostly on-the-ground installers, small shops. And then thirdly, a situation which is somewhat akin to what we are experiencing right now, which is you have a relatively even mix of large and small installers. Although I would still say, quoting from the numbers I have from the recently released GTMCI Solar Market Insight report, that that share, in terms of market share, we're already looking at Solar City and Vivint representing over 50% of residential installers or installations. So let's see what our audience has to say about this.
Oh, didn't count down.
Wow.
Let's do this again. And one more time. Apologies here.
you count hands.
So,
A roll call vote.
okay, finally back on track. Okay, well, so it looks like we have only a small fraction of the audience going for option number 2, which is a large number of small installers. This is a sort of a populist, sentimental choice, perhaps, affecting things, which we understand. But overwhelmingly, you have about an even split between people going for a small number of large installers, or a relatively even mix of large and small installers. So I'm wondering, once again, if which of you, if any, voted for option number 2? Mike again. And I'm very curious to know your reasoning here.
So I grew up in the residential business. We had a residential business from 2002 to 2009. And I mean, what I remember about the residential business is that it's each geography, even within a state and across states, is just so different in terms of some of the challenges with permitting and the engineering challenges and the types of marketing you have to do, and et cetera, and that it's very difficult to scale. And when you look at those challenges, that might be why when you look at other things that have to do with the home, whether it be real estate, brokerages or home improvements or whatever, it tends to be a very local market with lots of small players. And I do think there are aspects of the business that it makes sense to scale, and aspects of the business at Solar City and Vivint, those guys are scaling, like the financing and aggregating pools of financial products and developing technology and et cetera. But in the end, it does feel like eventually maybe those guys become the arms dealers for this network of local installers who have very low customer acquisition costs because they're so close to the customers. So I mean, that's been my experience in the industry.
Right, and that's a model that's already in practice with some of the larger
Yeah, like
installers.
Clean Power Finance and those guys, yeah.
Sanjay, I'm curious to know how you voted on this question, whether given...
Yeah, you'll be shocked to know I did not vote for number 2. So I voted for number 1, and the reason why is I think it really matters when you take this snapshot. So this is 2030. This is way out, and if you think about the presentation from earlier this morning about when the lines cross and what these various state markets look like, it's very different in 2017 versus 2020 versus 2030. So if you expect that the retail electricity prices continue to increase for end users over time, then the lines cross in a lot more parts of the country. And while if you just look at the map, it may look like more like a number 3 perhaps. If you look at where the population centers are, the vast majority of those customers are going to be in states and utility service territories where there's a very strong value proposition, and that's a place where the larger companies can go and will make sense to set up business if they're not there already. So I think we'll end up with number 1, that's a natural evolution of the market and consolidation, but it will depend on the particular market. So you'll have states and service territories where it is quite fragmented because the economics are more challenging.
Josh, I can see you're itching to speak.
So I picked number 2. I agree with Mike. It's and obviously contrarian here. And I'm going to be very careful with what I say from where I'm positioned in the room next to you and in front of everybody here. But I view most of solar, let's call it hardware, as commodities. And so I think the scale argument of some of the big companies might not necessarily play out in terms of getting the cheapest panels from volume supply agreements and things like that. I think by 2030, there will be almost no marginal cost for almost any part of the hardware supply chain. ITC, I think, certainly by 2030, we can assume will be long gone, so there won't be need to raise tax equity funds and things like that. So I don't think that scale matters. And in terms of, and I agree with the comments about solar being kind of like a construction industry where it's a local industry. If you're going to redo your kitchen or your bathroom, you're not going to call KBB Homes generally, or KB Homes. So tend to agree that everyone will have access to the same hardware. And then with a lot of the innovations that we're seeing from folks like Clean Power Finance and a lot of the other, there's a lot of private startups I talk to that are trying to do Expedia type models or just using software to acquire customers at almost no marginal cost. Again, enabling a larger class of smaller installers. That's just some of the reasoning behind why I think a lot of the smaller ones can survive.
Right. How about you, Justin?
So, I don't have a preference for any particular business model and represent all sorts of companies. But I'll be kind of a jerk and notice that none of these are really mutually exclusive, the way they're written.
Right.
But I think that, just if you look at the market share of Solar City, you can't have a large number of those before there's no market left. So there clearly has to be a small number of large installers if they're going to be really large. Otherwise, it's 3 companies at most, right? And I think the points that both Mike and Josh made were completely valid, and it is in fact what we see. And but at the same time, there's plenty of room for lots of innovative business models, and large companies can continue to have significant market share in the same way we see sort of Apple and versus Android, right, in the smartphone space. And one is a very coherent set of products that Apple controls, and people feel very comfortable with it, and it's very low risk. And the other one provides lots of different opportunities that someone can tailor a little bit more to their needs. And I think that there's plenty of room for both business models to succeed.
Right. So Josh, actually, I just want to come back to the couple of points you made. So I totally understand the point you made about the local feet on the ground, but then in terms of volume purchase discounts just seem to be sort of a fact of life in the business world. So, and maybe Mike, this is something for you to respond to. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the buying power of a big installer like Solar City or even Borrego, I mean, how would an independent installer long-term sort of compete there? I mean, you made a point about hardware costs, but I'm still wondering.
I'm guessing, so obviously, yeah, a small mom and pop installer won't have nearly the same volumes. I guess what I'm assuming is that they're working with a large distributor that is taking, multi-gigawatts of panels from the Chinese manufacturers or whoever, and just operating on just traditionally like an Arrow or a Future Electronics type of model, just super thin margins. And by the way, so the large folks, if they do exist, will have an advantage, but is it 1 cent, 2 cents, 3? I don't think it's material enough to force out the small guys from the market. That's probably what I should have said.
Right. So yeah, actually, I think that's an interesting point. What Justin, you made, and then Mike essentially made, which is that these options aren't actually mutually exclusive. You can have a scenario. I think we should maybe made that the 4th option, where the feet on the ground are local installers, but then they're contracting for or essentially tied to some of the bigger players. So that's something definitely for us to think about if this question makes it to another conference. Okay, so the 4th question, and this again ties back to some of the topics that Shail was talking about in the morning presentation. What do you see as the biggest threat to the growth of US solar in the next decade? One is net metering policies. We obviously know that net metering, net energy metering, big battleground for solar right now. 2, natural gas prices. Once again, there's a lot of naysayers in terms of solar, and that's one of the points that they frequently mentioned. The Marcellus Shale, where gas prices are in the US right now. 3rd is stagnating system costs, and we've seen a tremendous reduction in system costs driven by primarily falling module prices, but a lot of other factors as well over the last half decade. And there is a line of thought which suggests that perhaps these will start plateauing out pretty soon, and that could produce some challenges in terms of driving further growth. 4th would be grid integration challenges, which again Energy Gang talked a lot about. And then 5th, I think I'm guessing, or that Mike might enjoy this particular option, which is there's no threat really. So let's hope that we have a smoother experience for the countdown this time. This is interesting. This is our first 5-choice question. So predominantly looks like, again, an even split between net energy metering policies and grid integration challenges. This is an interesting one, I think. And then you have mid to high single-digit responses for natural gas pricing, stagnating system costs, and the eternal optimist. And in fact, looking at this question, there should have been a 6th option, which is essentially some form of utility opposition to solar in the form of rate restructuring, right? So feel free to actually, I'm sure you've all voted, but feel free to take up that option as well in your answers. And I'd like to hear all of your responses here. Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about rate restructuring is great, and I chose, in fact, number 1 there. I view rate structures and net metering as being one and the same. They're very intimately related, and the reason I have concern about it is not because I don't think that I think solar has a great value there, and we're on the right in every case where we're doing battle. The challenge is that there are hundreds of utilities in the U.S. that'll each have their own rate cases and issues with net metering as solar becomes a significant factor in those territories. And it's very challenging for the solar industry to be actively engaged in each one of those proceedings, and with the resources that we have. So again, another plug to be involved in the policymaking process and be involved with both the national and state CETA chapters.
I picked 4, basically assuming that fictional option number 6 was also kind of rolled up in number 4, some sort of utility opposition, which I guess could also be part of number 1. The reason I didn't pick net metering specifically is because I view that mostly as a residential problem, which is obviously 1/3 of the solar market. So, there will be battles that are fought and won, I think, on both sides in net metering, as we're already seeing. So that, maybe we'll call that a push. So I do think that utilities fighting back against, whether it's grid defection or whether it's larger projects or even their commercial customers kind of going more solar or solar and storage, I view those all as big potential risks.
Sanjay?
I would have chosen a different option, which is the anti-solar rate design or tariff changes driven by utilities. If you look at the net metering programs that have been attacked by utilities across the country, whether it's in large markets like Arizona or California or some smaller markets, they've mostly failed because when the public has learned of those proposals and they've become engaged, they've been very clear in what they want their policymakers to do, which is allow them to continue to have the choice to go solar and to get fair credit for any power that they export to the grid. So, and I do think it's important with number 1 to distinguish between net metering and rate design, because net metering doesn't in and of itself lock in what your tariff is. It does depend on the underlying rate design. And so what you've seen happen is as the utilities have increasingly failed to end or limit net metering policies that are in place, they've shifted to attacking rate design. And so trying to increase fixed charges significantly for residential customers, trying to end low or no demand tariff low demand charge optional tariffs for customers. Those things really can have a difference, can make a difference, as we heard earlier this morning. So I would say anti-solar rate design changes are very significant. And then, because I was forced into voting here, grid integration is a big challenge, I think. It's an engineering challenge that can be met. What that really was going to depend in part on is how willing our regulators, our public utilities commissions and public service commissions are to force utilities to actually work with the industry on those solutions, because they do exist.
I wanted to choose 1, 2, and 4, but I chose 1 for similar reasons. I think to the rest of the panel, I grouped the rate design in there. I think rate design and net metering together, and then utility opposition on top of that is the biggest challenge.
Right. So this is especially relevant because our next panel, which is actually called the Utility Solar Nexus, and we're going to be talking to some utilities there and hearing their views. So I think what this shows is that there's a general sentiment since this conference began that the generally sort of utility opposition to solar in its various forms is what the industry is afraid of, and I think it'll be interesting to hear from the utilities about that topic later on. So moving on to the 5th question, and that's That's a segment-specific question here, and this is where your answers might betray the segments that you specifically play in. So by 2020, what will be the largest segment of the U.S. solar market in terms of annual installations? So number one is residential, number two is commercial, but being consistent with the GTM definition, we refer to this as a non-residential sector because we also want to include government and non-profit public works projects in this segment as well. And then finally, you have the utility scale segment, again defined as one being not by size, but where the utility is actually the off-taker here. So let's hear what you guys have to say about that. Okay, so the winner here in terms of the audience sentiment is that residential will be the largest market. And I think if I remember my numbers correctly, and shame on me if I don't, being a GTM analyst, I think for last year there was a relatively even split between the three segments. 41% say it's going to be residential, 34% commercial, and then a relative minority in the utility scale segment. And I'm particularly interested to know if any of you voted for number 3, because in the way we see it, there are some challenges in the way. Chael mentioned that the ITC step down would probably hurt the utility scale segment more than residential and commercial. You also have the specter of gas prices. You also have the issue of the saturation of RPS requirements. So I'm curious to know, in fact, all of your answers, Justin.
So I chose
it's
commercial.
hard. It's like choosing between your children. It's hard.
It's right. I chose number 2, partly because the cost structure between utility and commercial, the gap is narrowing in some ways, especially for large commercial projects. But I see the distinction between these potentially becoming a little bit squishy depending on how you interpret rate design and different potential remuneration for DG changes coming down the future.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean,
once again, you're trying to deconstruct the structure of the question itself, Justin.
Right. So, I guess if you looked at some of the utility DG procurement rounds that we've seen in the past, I mean, they've largely not done a lot, but you have seen efforts for utilities to procure on large commercial rooftops, and we've seen Prologis do its thing with selling PPAs for power coming off of its warehouse rooftops. And that's a commercial system that has a utility off-taker. So you can see lots of ways where you can start mushing these together. And
Right.
I think there's opportunity for all of them to grow pretty substantially, and it's just going to be how you delineate them.
Spoken like a true CR representative. Josh.
Thanks.
I picked number 1 for 2 to 3 reasons, depending how you segment them. Number 1, residential just happens to be the largest electricity segment in the country. It's not by a long shot, but slightly above commercial. So the second point is it's kind of the commercial space is still very fragmented. I think a lot of people are trying to do or they're elephant hunting or whale hunting. And I think commercial also requires probably a degree of storage. And remember, this is kind of what Sanjay pointed out for one of the other questions. Make sure you look at the time frame. By 2020, that's not too far from now. I think we were talking about storage a lot yesterday, and that's a great macro, and they're making great progress there. I just don't know if storage will be there yet in terms of tremendously compelling by 2020. So it's the fragmented nature. And then third, so as part of that fragmented nature, I really do like what companies like SolarCity and Vivint and smaller installers that can access large pools of capital are doing from a third-party ownership model. I think that's tremendously compelling for the average consumer. It's basically, I like to joke, it's the American dream. It's buying something you can't afford. It's getting a really expensive solar system on your roof, but paying nothing for it and spreading it out and letting someone else get the arbitrage on the finance. So anyway, that's why I like the residential space in the near term.
I agreed with the audience on this one, and I think you have to look at the pull-in effect of the ITC stepping down at the end of 2016, if in fact it does, and then the fact that the demand for a lot of utility scale projects to this point has been linked to a state procurement mechanism like an RPS, And in our biggest market, California, the future of the RPS is very much in question now. The governor has indicated he wants to pursue something more focused on carbon, and perhaps not as targeted. So I think the good news is all three of these segments are going to continue to grow, and we're just talking about which is going to be the biggest. I think there is a huge opportunity to scale residential for the reasons that Josh noted.
I mean, I'm totally biased, so I picked number 2, obviously. But I think that so we do a lot of development of ground-mounted systems, and what we see in our business and then what we see just across the globe is that ultimately everybody starts to recognize that solar's advantage is that you can put it on already developed land, right? You can put it on rooftops, you can put it on parking lots, you can put it inside where the load pockets are. And that eventually policy and sentiment tends to push everybody back into that already developed land, which is why there will always be ground mounts, but I don't see that as the future. And then we just see that commercial has the right combination of some amount of economies of scale, but still being inside that load pocket. So it seems like the sweet spot.
Sticking to the party line there. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, but I really want to get at least 3 more questions in if we can do that. So moving on to number 6. Okay, and this is about manufacturing, which is what I focus in. Which statement most accurately reflects the future of solar manufacturing in the US? And to be clear, we're talking about manufacturing any solar components and materials, not just panels. 1, we're headed for a resurgence in domestic manufacturing, perhaps spurred by the existing trade duties that will be finalized probably at the end of this week or beginning of next week. Number 2, the US will be home to a few individual plants, but most components will be shipped from overseas. Number 3, ultimately there'll be virtually no domestic manufacturing. And 4, none of the above. Now, I'm having a hard time seeing how none of these 3 options would take place. But, so I might have a conversation with the intern that designed this question afterwards. Okay, so as close to consensus as one could hope for with an audience's size. Almost 3/4 of the audience essentially picking a mixed option, which is and representative of what is probably right now the reality, which is there are some individual large plants in the US, but most components are shipped abroad. I'm curious if any of you have a dissenting opinion here. Okay, I see Justin.
So I chose number 1, and maybe you can call me an optimist on this, but with increased visibility into significant demand in the domestic market over the long term, we're at the point where we can actually see a future of maybe a handful of gigawatt scale factories having healthy utilization rates in the U.S. And to the extent that the actual base economics between manufacturing in the U.S. versus low labor cost countries narrows, the shipping costs will matter a little bit. But also, let's not forget that a lot of components are already made in the U.S. and including a lot of inverters. Maybe not the subcomponents of the inverters necessarily, or all the subcomponents of panels, but we make a lot of polysilicon. We make a lot of racking. We make a lot of some other BOS materials, back sheets. And so there's a real opportunity to, if not ensure where most of the manufacturing is happening in the U.S., but really have an opportunity to make that possible because we have the market demand to support that in the future.
Mike, you feel the same way?
Yeah, no, I do. It seems to, I've been reading a lot about the auto industry and how that evolved over time, and it feels very similar where the combination, the Japanese were taking over the world by manufacturing cars domestically in Japan and then importing it. And the combination of tariffs and then ultimately the cost to ship these heavy things to where the demand is, they started to export their manufacturing expertise to other places. And I know that all of the Chinese manufacturers are in the process of tier ones or of creating plants somewhere else, not necessarily in the US, but somewhere outside of China. So I think it's coming.
I voted for number 1, and part of the reason for that is you have to look at the future of the U.S. market. So when the U.S. market is and continues to be one of the largest solar markets, installation markets in the world, then it's going to make a lot more sense to manufacture even more here. And so some of these answers may not be mutually exclusive. We can have a resurgence, and maybe you still have a scenario that's like number 2. But I think you'll see increased investment in domestic manufacturing.